Welcome back to the second panel of the 20th Anniversary Symposium of the India-China Institute. This panel has the topic De-globalization and the new international political economy. We are in the strange moment where we are assaulted day by day, sometimes hour by hour, by this green light, red light game of the Trump administration announcing changes to tariffs. And along with tariffs, terms such as de-globalization, industrial policy, economic nationalism have all become common parlance. And it's led to a certain amount of anxiety and hand-wringing and calls for return to normalcy, to return to rules-based capitalism, predictability for stock markets, for investors, for governments. But this is taking place, I think, against a longer-term, broader backdrop where there have been long-standing calls and narratives, especially from scholars and governments in developing countries where there was never any real romance around globalization. In fact, it was commonly termed as hyper-globalization, which came in the way of governments being able to focus on social policies. What was called rule-based international order in some places was seen in other places as marked by really asymmetric transactional relations and frequent economic coercion. There was a kind of invisibilization of the pain and of the suffocating debt burden of the poorest countries in the world in this so-called rule-based international order. Multilateral institutions like the WTO, which we have now become really nostalgic about, countries had lost trust in it even before the Trump administration, and to some extent the Biden administration and the Obama administrations hollowed it out. So this panel, we are hoping, will consider these ruptures in international political economy, both most recent but also medium term, not ignoring the contradictions and perversions that have animated this order, discuss implications for countries, sectors, regions. But I also hope that instead of talking just about a return to the older status quo, we might be able to discuss what might be alternative features, what might be features of a more desirable future, and what role countries like India and China, but not just India and China, also other countries in the global south like Brazil, South Africa, smaller countries might play in this future scenario. So I feel we are very lucky to have the panelists we do today. As you will note, the program has detailed bios, so I won't read them out in full, and there's no way I can possibly do justice to all their achievements, so I'm going to give a very brief bio of each of the speakers. Our first speaker will be Min Ye. She's a professor of international relations at the Pardee School of Global Studies at Boston University. She's also a member of the India-China advisory board, and so we have benefited from her inputs for a few years now. Her interests have been in Chinese political economy, China and India comparisons, East Asian international relations, and globalization. She has done a lot of work on the Belt Road Initiative, including the new Green Belt Road. And she's the author of The Belt Road and Beyond, State Mobilized Globalization in China, 98 to 2018. And also Diaspora and Foreign Direct Investment in China and India. The second speaker is going to be Ravi Kanbur, who's the T.H. Lee Professor of World Affairs at Cornell University. He's taught at Oxford, at Cambridge, at Princeton, and Columbia Universities in the past, but he's also had a long career at the World Bank, where he was the resident representative in Ghana, the chief economist of the Africa region, and principal advisor to the chief economist of the World Bank. There are lots of accomplishments, posts that I'm not going to read about, but his research has focused on public economics, development economics, and economic theory. His most recent book is International Development, Ideas, Expertise, and Prospects, and also Climate Justice, Integrating Economics and Philosophy. Our final speaker is going to be the New School's own William Milberg, who's professor of economics at the New School for Social Research. Many of us also knew him as the dean of NSSR, a role that I think played for 10 years. His research has focused on the relations between globalization and income distribution and the history and philosophy of economics. He has written extensively and is also focusing these days on economic causes and consequences of the multinational retreat from liberal democracy. He's the author of Outsourcing Economics, Global Value Chains in Capitalist Development, and then other books that you can read about in the bio. So without further ado, Min, the floor is yours.
Hello. So I'm the tech tester, and also my eyesights are getting worse, despite this is a pair of new transition glasses that I got, but it's tricky. So I want to really thank the ICI and congratulations to Mark and Manjari and Grace and colleagues here for this 20 years, very productive, very fruitful, and very lasting run of the Center and the China-India exchange. And not to mention this conference from yesterday, and I'm sure today's conversation will be just awesome. So I titled my talk today as Competitive Convergence, China and India in the New Global Era. And it's not very systemic. It's kind of my own collections of observations of China and India from the placing in Boston. So I guess being based in the U.S. as an academia, there is benefits. Actually, we get to hear so many different voices from both countries. And I cherish those voices and those networks, and try to be helpful to all visitors, guests from China and India as possible. And my own conclusion and reflection might be very different from any one of them, but I will share my intellectual perspective on China and India's latest change. So I think there should be a heading, but do you get? Okay, that's okay. So basically, some preliminary observations I want to start. The first is in my rather realist political economist observation vantage point. De-globalization has been a norm, and the hyper-globalization had a lot to do with American dominance and the change, rapid improvement in technology, information technology, global capitalism. So we actually lived in a very interesting decades. I do see my life and your life in the last 30, 40 years are just really witnessing a major transformation in the global order. And then I always look at comparative perspective from the developing countries who are part of this globalizing process, and yet were almost not being treated centrally. And I treat China, India's experiences centrally. To me, their embrace, their reaction defined globalization just as much as the core America. And so from these two countries' perspective, I see their reactions has always been resistance and embrace combined, and nationalism and globalization coexisting. And so forever, as I observe the two countries, they have pursued globalization cautiously and selectively, aligning global engagement with their own core domestic interests. So what's the core domestic interests are really the evolving factors of their global engagement. And so I use competitive convergence to describe the current era and perhaps more than a decade in the two countries. I see simultaneous rise of nationalist and globalizing economic strategies in both countries, right? And so the Chinese, the recent period, the change, I think it started after 2008, the global financial crisis. That was a turning point. And that was a period that the Chinese elites, state elites, recognized that the Western model could fail. And the shift of mentality was very palpable, right? Because before 2008, Chinese state elites, business elites, basically saw Americans advise, suggestions, lessons to be the one that will guide their moves for their national development objective. And after 2008, they saw, so this is a mindset change, but also there were a lot more opening for the Chinese to do more strategic globalization strategies. So as a result, then we saw a continuous rise of techno-nationalism within China. So these are more a few selected industrial policies in the last decade. The new EV policies in 2021, made in China in 2025, although it was passed in 2015, and the BRI in 2014 to 2016. And then during the COVID, which again, no one could go to China, but the change was much more profound than recognized from outside. The first change is a new infrastructure plan. China really made its country fully connected, digitalized for new EV, for e-commerce, for the new economy. And then the second was dual circulation, right? So the Chinese economy used to be very much oriented toward global markets, and the dual circulation in response to the COVID shutdown. Basically, when COVID occurred, like 80% of exporters, their orders got canceled. So the gravity was very severe. And so you have dual circulation trying to use e-commerce, use a government stimulus to direct markets to domestic consumers rather than international ones. So they didn't really reduce capacity, just change the capacity. And the chart was not made by me, rather by CNA. So the summary of the 2025, the latest industrial policy priority. Right? So this already went beyond the COVID period identified sectors. So basically transforming traditional industries, future industries, robotics would be the main one, and artificial intelligence, as well as national hinterland development. So the Chinese, of course, top-down policy tend to be rather extensive and cover all. And once we get into the implementation, then a lot of changes would be, or variations actually would dominate the implementation. Now coming to India, I see a lot of similarity between China and India. I will make this bold observation. In my interactions of Chinese and Indians, as well as other countries' citizens, I see these two countries' citizens, their mindset, their thinking, their diversity, their internal differences are most similar. The degree and the scale, the spectrums are very similar across the two. So I really cherish my opportunity to be able to hear and see and observe very different types of individuals from both countries. But as a whole, I see the Indian bureaucracy or the state is doing the green development really quite rather similarly to China. And so they see the climate change and green transition as very vital to its global prestige and standing. So that's one of the reasons why India has a factor endowment for labor-intensive industries. It's just very difficult for India to work on the path that China had done before as coming out of the communist period. India's new Green Deal, again, very aggressive, very coordinated as well at the national level. But it was shaped by commercial motivations. So there are a lot of interest, a lot of market opening in the green sectors, and that's where Indian Green Deal actually is pursued rather forcefully. The Indian economic state, again, I hear our Indian colleagues, feel very disillusioned with Indian bureaucracy or the effectiveness of economic planning. Maybe my vantage point is like from the China's perspective, you pretty much can apply the same criticism and observations of the problems in the Chinese economic state. So I'm not making judgment of who is right, who is wrong, but what we see is that India is also being very persistent in conducting economic planning, and the implementation is highly decentralized. So you have pioneer states in India doing a lot more aggressive green transition versus more laggard states following up and providing very different terms to develop the new electricity sector. And then Indian technocratic restructuring, this is a new observation, but I was pretty surprised that India could change the State Planning Commission into NITI, and the NITI is very much mirroring China's NDRC. Right. Although the difference is, of course, India doesn't have a very very well-established political institutions as embedded in the Chinese Communist Party governance. Right? India is a democracy and with very diverse party politics going on in the country. So that difference is right there. But I wouldn't put that as major hurdle for India to achieve techno-economic ambition. In other words, you don't need to mirror 100% of China outcome to be a successful economic power. And there also the excessive economic power seeking in the Chinese model, right? So size and dynamics do show in the Indians' pursuit. So these two figures are very striking, right? We can hear Apple assembly in India as evidence for Indians' inability to catch up, right? But once we put that in perspective, it's actually major achievement. India's iPhone production started very late, right? And it did take them 10 years. That's not unusual if we think about the supply chain networks construction in China. But there is a dynamic with size. So from 0% of iPhone production in India to 10% of global production in India. It took 10 years for Apple to achieve. But then the next 10% increase only requires 2 years. And now with tariff war going on, again, this is from these economic observers, it's India might be able to fulfill American market, right? Not the global market, but American market in a short time of 18 months or even less, right? So the U.S. market could be filled. And I was also very struck by the solar panel exports from India. Again, this is a global chart. So India's solar panel progress is very impressive, but it does have high unbalance in this sector, right? So India imports significant numbers of solar panels, modules from abroad, and then it exports is in a much smaller volume, but the share is increasing. More important, last year, India became the number one exporter to American markets, right? Solar panel. Although whether there is assembling from China, that might be true. But the Chinese first 20 years of export miracle was largely assembly. Right? So the future I think will be decided by one is in this kind of China-India disparity of the trade. Right? It will be very difficult for India to kind of reduce its import dependence on China. Like the more export success India achieves, the more the import dependence it has to rely on China in the short term at least. So this will be a lasting trend and lasting opportunity, but also lasting tension. And then in terms of population, in India, according to the current projection, right, the World Bank anticipate that India's population will be double China by 2100. Although we are not here, but 2 years ago, India is already number one, right? And the Chinese birth rate is just not increasing. If you spend time in China, you'll know the Chinese women do not want to have children. And so the family dynamic have totally shifted. And here maybe I'll make a point that is like in my generation, right, or even 10 years before, the measurement of the good kids, like good youth, are work hard, study hard, go to find jobs in Shenzhen or Shanghai, these big cities. But now the measurements of good kids are just getting married and have children, and the elders, will just give them everything. So the mindset has shifted, and so the youth do want to, middle class youth do want to have stable job. If not stable job, then just have staying home job, right? And so this, I would not anticipate this could happen so quickly in China. I think this is due to the transformational digitalization, automation, jobless growth in the country, right? But also the increasing wealth of society, right? Because lying flat, this term of lying flat in China is actually feasible. But the Chinese working women, young women, like with all kind of support they have, they are not going to have more than one kid. So it's very interesting that the value structure has shifted. Although I also saw population experts writing to say that the best population size for China is actually 770 million, because that's perfect for China to take on the space they have and have sufficient use of technology. Right? Now, China-India relations, I think, so I see a lot of competition, and the competitive logic is sustainable. Right? You have border, but more importantly, technology has become a new security arena. And then the renewables. China now dominates, but India is really trying to cut in this sector. And then geopolitical competition, in terms of regional grouping, like you are very clear, they have preferences and they try to be a decisive actor in the competing regional groupings. So India deliberately not to join the RCEP, Regional Cooperation, Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. Basically, the most of East Asian plus Asian countries minus India, and China is leading that. And then Quad, which is also expanding its links to Europe and elsewhere. India is really decisive. So if we think about physics, right, some of the actors, their positions are set, like U.S., Australia, and Japan. It's very difficult to get any flexibility on their positions vis-a-vis China. But India is the change factor, the variable. And in other regions, so I also am the benefits of working on BRI, and in Boston is we get to hang out with a lot of regional centers. So they observe, like in Central Asia or Southern Caucasus, Middle East, Africa, South Asia, the China-India presence are both rising. And competition and it is increasing, but competition sometimes is good, So I don't think that means bad. So this is the last slide, and I'll end here. Some very tentative observation from me. One is I do think India stands at a golden opportunity. Right? They have the opportunity to industrialize and emerge as an economic superpower by aligning with the US-led global capitalist order. Because although US, in terms of relative economic power, the US is in decline, but still the world's most largest capitalist order. And then I also feel like if you look at Indian sectors, like area they achieved success, you do see more repressive, more control over labor rights, right? Over land, crackdown on land protests. So that of course was the source of China's success. So I'm afraid that, not afraid, I feel this might be a trend that will observe. A rise in India will become regionally aggressive and domestically repressive. That's common, that's normal. And China-India rivalry will intensify on multiple terrains. Right? Again, being clear about the parameters of competition and then work along those parameters, I think that's a possibility for lasting relationship. Okay, thank you so much.
Good. Well, thank you for the invitation. Very happy to be here. So my presentation is going to be somewhat out of left field so far as this conference is concerned. I won't be talking specifically about India and China, certainly not compared to Minier's fantastic presentation just now. But I will be talking about trade policy. And I hope that what I say will be useful in the discussion, at any rate. So, item 6 of the Washington Consensus. Now, Washington Consensus, of course, is a term of abuse in some quarters. What was item 6 of the Washington Consensus of the 1980s and 1990s? So, actually, that's the outline of my talk. So, item 6 of the Washington Consensus was trade policy. And basically, it argued that there should be massive trade liberalization in the developing countries. And there's the quote, access to imports, et cetera, and protecting domestic industries against foreign competition is viewed as creating costly distortions that end up penalizing exports and impoverishing the domestic economy. That was a fundamental premise according to which the Washington Consensus operated. And of course, many of us, including myself, spent the 1980s and 1990s from outside and inside the Bretton Woods institutions arguing against key elements of the Washington Consensus. Manjari mentioned that I was in the World Bank for about 10 years, and I fought the good fight inside and also on the outside. In particular, those of us arguing against the Washington Consensus, we argued against this negotiating position of the BWIs, or of the Bretton Woods institutions, which seemed to amount to the only good tariff is a zero tariff. We'd start with that negotiating position, and then we'll talk. Okay. And I asked myself, and this is myself I asked, is there not something contradictory in the same people, including myself, now seemingly arguing that high tariffs all around are not such a good thing for each country and indeed for the world as a whole? It's that contradiction that I want to explore in this talk. And I want us to get away from, well, it's neither too high nor too low, it has to be somewhere in the middle, et cetera, because then you have to tell me where in the middle, what are the principles according to which you arrive at that. So, and in exploring this contradiction, I want to leave to one side the crucial implementation issues which color the current discourse. Okay? Obviously, the capriciousness and the swings of the actual sequence of announcements, this way, that way, etc., and the uncertainty that causes is a large part of the current critique, and we shouldn't minimize that at all. Okay? But that's not going to be my focus here, because in some sense it's too easy to say this is all, we don't know what's going on, etc., and that's clearly right. But what I want to consider are the intellectual twists and turns. The twists and turns in the intellectual basis of the low tariff stance in trade policy that was reflected in the Washington Consensus. And where do we stand on that now? Especially since all of us seem to say, well, low tariffs are not such a bad thing after all. So to get us on the same page, let us start with some basics. What was the underlying logic of the trade liberalization stance of the Washington Consensus? Now, it's meant to apply to a small economy, meaning by that the actions of that economy cannot by themselves influence world prices. And this characterization, 35, 40 years ago, applied to African countries then, and of course it applies to them now. And actually it applied to China then and India then, in terms of their trade positions, but of course not now. For such small economies, it was argued that the imposition of a tariff by that small economy is an act of self-harm. And remember, this is what we're saying now about the Trump thing. We're saying it's an act of self-harm to impose these tariffs. That's what we were saying 35, 40 years ago for developing countries. That's what the Washington Consensus was saying. What happens when you impose a tariff for this small economy is obviously, because prices go up, domestic producers gain, the government revenues increase, because there's a tariff revenue, but in a well-specified sense, which I'll come to, these do not make up for the losses of consumers who lose because prices go up. The country as a whole loses because the gains of the gainers are less than the losses of the losers, in a well-specified sense, which I'll come to. And hence the case then for reversal and lowering of tariffs. Because when you lower tariffs, producers lose because the prices come down, and government revenues decrease because tariffs come down. But the gains of the consumers, again in a very well-specified sense, make up for these losses. That is the logic of the tariff argument. In fact, actually, this is the argument that has been made throughout the ages. Not just now, not just 30 years ago. Actually, it's the argument in the debate on the repeal of the Corn Laws in the post-Napoleonic Britain. Indeed, The Economist magazine was actually founded to make the case for lower tariffs in the repeal of the Corn Laws in early 19th century Britain. It's a long-standing argument. So how did we, those of us who were arguing against this position, counter that logic, counter the logic of lowering tariffs in the debates of 3-4 decades ago? Well, we argued against that in a well-specified sense part of the argument, which in effect, what that did was it gave equal weight to the gains of each gainer and the losses of each loser. You simply add up the gains, the dollar value of the gain, and you just simply add them up. That's the well-specified sense. And of course, we argued that this was not valid, because the gains and losses to poorer sections of the society should be weighted more. And moreover, large losses to an individual should be weighed disproportionately compared to small gains to others. So a $1,000 loss to one individual is different from $1,000 losses to 10 individuals. You can't simply add up those 10 hundreds and compare it to the 1,000. That was a logic that we were using in our counter. So, for example, if lowering tariffs leads to losses for poor rural farmers, relative to gains for better off urban consumers, a social weighting scheme could still pronounce lowering of tariffs as a bad thing. That was our argument. That was my argument. We also argued, by the way, that revenue in the hands of the government had a high social value because of the need to supply public goods and the difficulties in these countries of raising revenue through conventional income tax instruments. Very difficult to go to hundreds of thousands of poor farmers and raise income tax from them. At the border, you can simply tax at the tariff, and that's how you get the revenue. And the social value of revenue in the hands of the government was very high because these public goods needed to be supplied: education, health, infrastructure, etc. That was another reason why lowering tariffs was a bad thing, because it would reduce revenue in the hands of the government, and revenue in the hands of the government is a good thing. You should weight it more. That was the argument, the counter-argument that we were putting. Thus, increased revenue in the hands of the government was a big plus for tariffs, something that progressives like us supported. And we therefore opposed item 6 of the Washington Consensus. And of course, more conventionally, and this we're all familiar with, we also argued for infant industry protection, the need to give manufacturing a breathing space to develop. And we were greatly influenced by the scholars of Indian economic history, who had documented how the nascent textile industry in India had been smothered by cheap Lancashire imports. You have to go back to read the writings of Dadabhai Naoroji and all of this, and you know exactly the whole intellectual sequence of those arguments. And I should say that we, who are taking this position, were not much influenced by the political economy counter-argument to our counter-argument, that the infant would never really grow up. Actually, the infant would grow up so much, it would become a giant, and you would not dare remove that protection once it was in. And especially if the infant was the president's nephew. And these political economy arguments were made to us. And we weren't stupid, we understood that. But on balance, we took the position that no, we should nevertheless oppose the reduction of tariffs. So finally, let me just also say that another class of arguments, of course, although we were focused on the small economy case, We were well aware, of course, that for a large economy in the world, there was a leeway to exercise that country's market power through what's known in the literature as the optimal tariff. Just as in the way that a monopolist or a monopsonist could squeeze more profit through use of pricing, a large country could squeeze more juice out of the world economy by applying a tariff against that economy. So if you're a large country, there's the optimal tariff argument. Actually, those of us who were in this argument, we railed against the Bretton Woods institutions for their hypocrisy in imposing zero tariffs through their conditionalities on small defenseless countries, while saying nothing about the tariff and non-tariff barriers imposed by big rich countries. That was a standard part of the argument at the time. How hypocritical of you to do this. We pointed out that these countries had industrialized behind barriers. Lancashire, Ahmedabad, textiles, okay, back in the late 19th century, early 20th century. We demanded that these big countries, rich countries, lower their tariffs to let in manufacturers for the poor countries. So we were saying, don't lower these tariffs, lower those tariffs. That was our argument. Let the exports in from these countries, because that's the basis for their development. We did not, I have to say, at least I did not, apply our reasoning symmetrically and draw the implication that such a lowering of tariffs in rich countries, by the same logic, the same argument, while benefiting their consumers, would lead to losses for their producers. That's what we were arguing for developing countries. And now we're saying, and we didn't take this argument on at all. We simply thought it was the right thing to do, to lower tariffs in those countries, open up those markets, let India and China export Vietnam, Bangladesh, etc., into those countries. And we did not symmetrically apply the logic that I just went through, that such losses could be concentrated amongst the poorest in rich countries. And I suppose to the extent that we thought about it at all, those of us arguing, on the one hand, resisting tariffs in poor countries and arguing for lower tariffs in rich countries, to the extent that we thought about it at all, I don't think we did. I suppose we applied a global roles-in perspective. The losers were relatively poor in their own countries, in rich countries, sure, but they were still better off than the poor in poor countries. If a Lancashire mill worker loses, but an Ahmedabad mill worker gains, okay, well, from a global roles-in perspective, that's okay. Or indeed a standard utilitarian perspective, that's okay, because the Lancashire mill worker is better off compared to the Ahmedabad mill worker. To the extent that we thought about it at all, that was the logic that we were using. And from our cosmopolitan perch, which all of us had, we resisted, therefore, lowering of tariffs in poor countries while pushing for lower tariffs in rich countries. And I would say that we're now reaping the whirlwind. You simply have to look at voting patterns in US counties related to the China shock, as it was called. And there's an explicit econometric analysis has been done on this thing. So, that's my sort of conversation with myself of how we've been going. And I'd like to see what your views are on this. But of course, the debates of the past may well be the debates of the past. They'll have to be recast for the new technological realities. There's still another 10, 15 years to go for this argument to still there, but labor-intensive manufacturing exports cannot now be the basis for economic prosperity in the medium term for the next 2 or 3 decades. A lot of empirical work is now showing that, and Minye's presentation was also getting to that point. And I think Craig's point was also, yesterday, was also along those lines. So in some sense, the use of tariffs for this objective will progressively become irrelevant. There was a debate of labor-intensive manufacture. That's what you export. That's what you've got to base your prosperity on. That's why you have to have blah, blah, blah. All of that sort of stuff will progressively become redundant. Item 6 of the Washington Consensus in terms of trade policy will progressively become redundant. Not immediately, not in the next year, but progressively become redundant. And secondly, returns to economic activity will become increasingly concentrated in the hands of owners and the managers of new technology. I think there's a general consensus on this, and again, Craig's presentation touched on this yesterday, and so on. So I would say, and this is, a lot of people have been saying this, the central problem of the next 2 or 3 decades will be the one of distribution and redistribution. The pie will grow. It's a question of what will happen to the distribution of that pie. But the point is that redistribution within a nation state is going to be severely constrained by the ability of the revenue base to relocate across borders. I argue in my writings that that is going to be a major issue in the next 20 to 30 years. On a business as usual scenario, this ability of tax base to shift, of revenue base to shift across the so-called BEPS, the base erosion and profit shifting, which is the acronym that the OECD uses for this, in the policy realm, will lead to race to the bottom to attract tax base. So there's a corporate sitting in Singapore which goes to the Indonesian government and says, we'd love to, we really love being here, but the Malaysian government is offering us shaving 5 percentage points off the corporate tax. We'd love, and of course they're saying the same thing to the Malaysian government as well. And you see this in the data. Corporate tax rates have been coming down over the years, and the race to the bottom component of this is actually quite an important part of this trend. And the point is that this ability of the tax base to shift, either through corporates or through individuals, is going to impair the ability of each nation state to address the rising inequality within its borders, which other empirical evidence suggests is going to be the issue of the coming 20 to 30 years. As I said, on this view, the important economic issue of the next 2 or 3 decades, already visible, but still mainly around the corner, will be not trade competition, but tax competition in its broadest sense. Okay, I'm talking about broadest sense, not, of course, corporate tax, but enforcement is a key factor. Okay, enforcement and tax rates are, in some sense, substitutes for each other. So we'll have high tax, but we look the other way when you come. So there are different aspects of tax policy. We can just use the label tax policy. So my argument is that the major issue of the next 2-3 decades will be not trade competition because of the technological trends, but tax competition in its broadest sense. The world will still need to address that zero-sum game, which I described to you when a corporate goes to Malaysia and Indonesia. It's just that the game will be a different one to the one that we've been debating over the last 20 to 30 years. Thank you very much.
Thank you. It's a hard act to follow because I, in some ways, want to talk about the U.S. tariff policy. So I'm thinking about a lot of things as I'm talking. First of all, congratulations to the Institute. 20 years, fantastic, great successes. I thought yesterday's session was very exciting, inspiring, and informative, and congratulations, and good luck for the next 20 years. So I'm the third speaker. I want to keep it simple. It's late morning, people are waiting for their coffee. 3 points I want to make. I'll try to do it quickly. I have a lot of kind of data to present, but I'll try to do it quickly. Each of my points are quite speculative. So I really also very much look forward to the discussion, and especially around this tariff issue, which, I was very interested to hear the phrase Pax Americana raised in the context of the India-China experience. And I do think, in reflecting a little on Ravi's presentation, that infant industry protection, which is the argument that many of us made over decades for raising trade protection, for developing country industries that were trying to gain kind of global foothold of competitiveness is quite different from high levels of tariff by the hegemon seeking a new way of generating Pax Americana. So it's quite different from that infant industry argument. Here are my 3 points. First of all, the shift from chimerica to a trade war is not just about deindustrialization. And I really would like to introduce the word corporate profits, which we got to at the end of the last presentation, but we hear many, many presentations about capitalism, about global supply chains, about trade wars, and we don't focus enough on profits. I want to kind of shift the focus to corporate profits and in a somewhat crude economic deterministic way, make the case for why there has been this massive political shift by the US from this kind of collaborative, deep collaborative, successful relation with China and Chinese export industries to a trade war today. Secondly, de-globalization, which is just the phrase in the title of the presentation, around the effort by particularly the US, and not just under Trump, but also under Democratic administrations, to kind of put up walls and limit the process, and in some ways reverse a process that we heard described in the last session, I will argue is not sustainable. And I do not think that the reindustrialization agenda in the US is going to succeed for reasons that I'll lay out. And I do think that the tariff policy is driven by other considerations that we can talk about. And thirdly, again, even most speculatively, that the US, any redesign of the multilateral system, if the de-globalization is not sustainable, and the global hyper-globalization that preceded it obviously exhausted itself, what's next? What's the redesign going to look like? We heard a little bit about that in the last presentation. And I will just say that it will have to deal with, this is more hope than kind of prediction. It will have to deal, in order to be sustainable, with 3 unsustainable forces: global imbalances, global inequalities, both within countries and across countries, and global warming. So I don't know I will speculate at the end about what that might look like, but that's the most speculative of the 3. So globalization, as predicted, had winners and losers. As the trade theory told us it would, there were huge successes, historic declines in poverty rates in China and India. There was rising inequality globally, not in all countries. There was a rising profit share of income globally, by the way, as trade expansion occurred, all associated with this trade expansion, but not fully explainable by it. And in the US, for example, it was not just about inequality. We kind of overuse that term as well, because there were kind of absolute declines and stagnation. I just reread the book by Anne Case and Angus Deaton, The Deaths of Despair. And it's really a superb book. It's about the rise of suicide, drug overdose, alcohol-related liver disease, and declines in lifespan, and the despair being very localized. So it was not just kind of inequality, although that's crucial way of thinking about it, but also kind of absolute decline in well-being, and in a very localized way that economists didn't predict, because they thought that labor was more mobile, and that economists didn't respond to, even though their theories told them there would be winners and losers, and that really the gains from globalization or liberalization would require compensation of those losers. So the result was a deglobalization that we've seen in the last 10 years. But again, not just Trump. We had Trump 1 tariffs. We had Biden continuing the tariffs and continuing to devalue the World Trade Organization, which the U.S. itself had championed by not reappointing appellate judges so that dispute resolution could not take place anymore within the World Trade Organization. And now we have the Trump tariff. So this is, of course, the iconic picture of US manufacturing employment and Chinese import penetration into the US. And we're all familiar in our own ways with different parts of this. But this, of course, leads ultimately, as Ravi pointed out, not just to the deaths of despair, but also to a political shift in electoral politics. And the economists have really done a great job in trying to understand this. I'm thinking of David Autor's work and others. The focus has been on labor. And they've even extended it to voting. But moreover, there's enormous amounts of focus on the decline of manufacturing labor and the deaths of despair and the employment declines. And what I want to shift to for a minute, very quickly, is a shift to profits. And again, here's my crude argument. My crude argument is that at a certain point, and I haven't identified, this is kind of ongoing research, at a certain point around 2011, I will say, when we hit peak globalization, something changed or was in the process, it wasn't sudden. Gradually there was a change, and it's not very revolutionary to say that the change was in the nature of the imports and the sectors that the US was importing increasingly, focused increasingly on, and that had a differential impact on the profits and on business. And in particular, so what I'm arguing is that the traditional argument is that trade liberalization would impose competitive pressures on domestic firms. In the globalization era that we see in this picture, the imports actually contributed to the profit rate and the profit share of the companies. There were inputs that made them able to, both because of their degree of concentration and because of their control of labor markets, their kind of monopsony power, to raise their markups and raise their profits, and the US profit share rose. And what I'm arguing is that imports don't always play that role, and that at a certain point in the 2010s, the role of imports in relation to profitability changed. And imports started now to compete directly with those profits rather than to serve those profits. So what I'm exploring hypothetically is imports being thought of in two different ways. Capital supporting imports, which was the first phase that you see in that graph that I showed previously, and then capital competing imports, which is increasingly the case in the last decade. And that the result of the capital competing exports substituting for the capital supporting exports is a pressure on profit shares or a different relation between imports and profits. And that different relation, and here's the crude economic determinism, underpins the political shift from chimerica to trade war, from friend to enemy. So I'm arguing that it's whatever. I know the political scientists here and political sociologists will have different ways of thinking about that shift. I'm giving a crude economic materialist explanation, and I'm maybe exaggerating, but I want to kind of raise that in the conversation. So the hypothesis is a new phase in US imports emerges with the expansion of capital competing imports. We've started to do research on this, and I'll present a couple of charts very simply. There's the profit share, and consumer goods decline and capital goods imports rise over that period. And I don't know where the break occurs in this capital supporting versus capital competing import. I'm going to switch to the next graph, because what we started to do was to look at the pre-2011 period and the post-2011 period and think about the relation of profits of those imports. And what we found was quite striking. The blue bars are the relation between sectoral import penetration correlated with profit share in that industry. And the red bars are in the later period. So the blue bars are 2002 to 2010, and the red bars are that correlation in 2011 to 23. I hope people can get that, which is that what I'm arguing is that the correlation between imports and profits shifts between the earlier period and the more recent period. Okay, and I don't want to go too far with this. We've started. I'll show one more of these graphs, and then I'll stop and move on to my second point. When you move, this is all imports. When you look at China, it gets even more stark, which is that the correlation between import penetration in the early period was very positively related to profits, and the red bars are the 2011 to 23 correlations, which are negative. So I want it's just to, we've done some econometric work which supports this on the earlier period with many variables included to control for different variables. But anyway, I think I've done enough on that first point, which the research is ongoing, and I want to throw it into the conversation. So I will, I mean, the reason for it is, of course, what we used to call in the global value chain literature, upgrading, right? That, and these are in the change in the industrial composition of Chinese imports by the U.S., from the U.S., right? There's not, you know, anyone who's not an economist, this is obvious, right? They upgraded into more high-tech sectors and were successful in those unless they were blocked by policy, such as in solar panels, for example. So, you know, this is the declining sectors between those two periods indicated in the title are leather products and apparel, and the growing sectors from a perspective of Chinese exports are electronics and machinery, and they are competing more and more with companies in the US, and therefore the chimerica, beautiful collaboration in the global era starts to disappear. And what we get is tariffs. The hegemon imposes walls as the imports are viewed as deindustrializing and, I argue, detrimental to profitability. And we're all familiar with this, and I haven't checked my email or my news feed in the last 15 minutes, so the graph might have changed, but we're all familiar of what's been happening. Although, as you say, the lack of clarity is a challenge for all of us. So I want to turn to my second main point about deglobalization not being sustainable in its current political form. And I'll make three arguments. The three arguments are that US tariffs are not likely to generate the US reindustrialization that is the stated goal. And I'll go through reasons for that. I'm calling it ISRI, somewhat tongue-in-cheek. We used to talk about ISI, import substitution industrialization. The US is trying something now, according, at least if you take it for, you know, on its surface value, import substitution reindustrialization. How to get those industries back, pump them back up. So the old infant industry argument and the ISI argument is now being translated to the hegemon. And I've put in this term ISRI, and I think it's not going to be successful. Secondly, I do think, apologies to Ravi for kind of appealing to the fact that there is a muddle about what this is about, what the goals really are for the US tariff policy. If they're not reindustrialization, there are other things. And finally, my third point is that without a redesign, this deglobalization phase is not sustainable. Okay? So I'm going to go quickly. The first is that U.S. has nothing new. This crowd knows these kind of data very well. Extremely high U.S. import dependence on China in very key sectors. So those are import shares of China. It's not that crucial, but it supports this notion that U.S. is heavily reliant in its imports on China. And so that puts into question the kind of ability to turn around industrially in those sectors. Secondly, the compensation gap, if you just look at labor compensation, between the US, for example, and China, and I put Mexico and Vietnam in this chart, are enormous. And in fact, I've been surprised that you see news reports of shutting down of Chinese factories because of a fear of orders declining, because it seems to me, even at tariffs of 150%, these these are going to be competitive exports. So I'm not quite sure what's going on. I think it's a case, and it's really a lesson for economists, which is that these substitution effects based on relative price changes are really swamped by what we call income effects, which is when you fear a recession and you fear orders will be canceled, that's when you close your shop, right? So I don't think it's so much about the relative price of even 150% tariff. If you add it to those labor costs in those other countries, is not going to reach, not going to impact their competitiveness. So I'm a little confused about that. Finally, China, as we heard in the first talk, has reduced its reliance on the US market in a number of ways. And that blue line is exports to the US as a percentage of GDP of the country itself. The orange line, that's China. The orange line or red line is the EU. China is now less reliant as a share of its GDP on the US market than the EU, which is surprising, but which I think Min spoke to, and which is going to lead to the challenge of the tariff policy being as effective as the reindustrializers hope. Just really quickly, this is a chart showing the foreign holdings, Chinese holdings of Treasury securities, and it relates to the other goals of the US policy around the dollar and the value of the dollar and the key currency role of the dollar. So China, even over the past 10 years, has reduced its holdings of of US Treasuries from 1.3 trillion to 700 million. Still a big number, almost 10% of total foreign holdings of Treasury securities, but a great decline in reliance. Okay, I want to just list a few other problems. There's two arguments for the reindustrialization. One is American firms will invest and rebuild in face of this protection that they have around them. The other is so-called tariff hopping, that foreign governments will invest in the US because to avoid the tariff. And I think tariff hopping requires policy certainty, and we have not yet seen that. If you're going to make an investment, you need to negotiate with a local and a national political figure. I would say tariff retaliation, which is what China has done and has promised to continue to do, further impedes this reindustrialization. I would argue, and I did support tariffs over many decades, selectively and supported by an investment policy, which we call industrial policy. And I thought, I thought the Biden Inflation Reduction Act was risky, and the Chips and Science Act was a risky strategy, but it had a chance given the investment infusion that the US government was going to do in addition to the tariff protection. Just that the last bullet point I should mention, which is that when you slow the import of products which you cannot compete competitively, which reduce global warming, you're you're contributing to an unsustainable global process. And I think this hasn't been addressed. So the second point is about other goals, and I'm going to skip over this just to get to the end, which is that other goals include devaluing the dollar and remaking the US financial system, the global financial system, and I'd be happy to talk about that. I think it's quite risky also and uncertain. The tariff revenue part for the hegemon, which really believed in liberalization, the tariff revenue to replace domestic revenue is a very, very difficult lift, and especially when you're looking at a major tax cut proposal in the US to further, and of course this is one of the goals of the tariff policy. I would argue, and I read the cryptocurrency dinner invitation list yesterday in the press, that that different people in the administration have different goals for the policy, and Trump has a kind of what I call neo-patrimonial mercantilist approach, which is maybe he can get something out of it. And those are the guys at the inauguration, and Tim Cook was standing in the next row. So what will replace it in my last minute? I was glad to hear that Gramsci is a right-wing thinker now, Craig, so the old world is dying. I always like to cite right-wing thinkers, and the new world struggles to be born. Now is the time of monsters. How will it be redesigned? And I'll just take 1 minute to say that, first of all, the imbalance between the US and China is very small as a share of US GDP. It's 1%. So what's all this about? Something else. So that says the US deficit with China is 1% of its GDP. Shoosh. There are problems. These are global imbalances, right? So the US has a big deficit globally, and China's deficit continues to grow. Germany and Japan's surplus has declined. So there are problems. Global imbalances are a problem. And this is the one which I think is not just a problem for the US, which is China's share of world manufacturing, projected to go from 30% to 45% by 2030. And this is not just the US that is concerned about that as an issue. So what does the redesign look like? Well, a rebalancing would require Chinese household consumption rising, US building a social safety net to underpin global economic change. Very difficult politically. But as I say, the rebalancing problem is maybe not the key feature of it. And so here's my last slide, which is, this is the most speculative. What would a new multilateralism look like? The national policy space, I think Ravi spoke to it really beautifully, which is about how countries, really, particularly small countries, suffered under the Washington Consensus. Labor standards, clearly the profit share rose globally through that period, and somehow we need to create institutions of countervailing power that arrest that process. Technology sharing, I mentioned it in the case of Chinese technology being shared more globally, but also the intellectual property limitations put a real constraint on innovation in developing countries through the liberal period. Cooperation around global warming, and I've spent a lot of time thinking about what was emphasized in the last talk about capital mobility and the abuse of tax havens and the decline of corporate profits tax, which relates to my first point around profitability and globalization. And I think there is a case for finding ways to adjust to these imbalances, which are progressive and expand demand and employment, rather than simply requiring deficit countries to cut demand through spending declines and austerity. Thank you.
Thank you for 3 really excellent, thought-provoking talks. There's a lot of ground and very different ground that each of you have covered. I have questions, but let this be an opportunity for the audience to come in with their questions. I think there's a mic going around, Nolan. Peter.
Thank you very much. Ravi is a colleague of mine from Cornell, and I'm one of those political scientists who does political economy, who you mentioned. Ravi, we both lived in upstate New York, and we could see it, the deindustrialization. Corona Smith, IBM were traded in for prisons. That's what our competitive advantage is now in upstate New York. And I never understood what you so beautifully articulated, why you could believe it. And I think the reason is that your understanding of IPE is capital I, small p, capital E. You do political economy, but the politics of it is undervalued in this 1980s, 1990s story. I wrote a book on small states in Europe, and my IPE is small I, capital P, big, small e. That is, the politics of that adjustment, of making it work, is enormously complicated, historically rooted, politically contingent, and forever, ever changing. So that's the background, and therefore I'm interested in, for both William and for you, for the future. I still think that you are adopting a capital I, small p, capital E perspective. But there is, I mean, William had in the last 4 slides, they went by too fast. There was a lot of capital P in there, particularly the neo-patrimonial state. What is happening for the taxation part of your argument in the future is a reduction, a systematic reduction of state capacity, which we are seeing in America now, in the political economy literature which I grew up in. We talked about the weak American state. That is, the regulatory system put up in the 1930s could be dismantled. Very different. This could not happen in Europe. State structures are different. They have a deeper foundation. So I would like you to, both of you, to think about a capital P for the kind of future which you're envisaging. With the politics here, I think, not following your logic, following another more brutal logic of decapitating the state.
No, I think the point is well taken, and indeed it's probably clear in the way that I was talking about the tax competition part of the story. So I was simply saying that that the domain of international competition is shifted from trade to taxation, and applying in some sense a conventional framework to say, well, what you need is an agreement, actually of the type that the Biden administration did begin to push through, the sort of the minimum corporate tax agreements and so on and so forth. And I guess the politics of that is what you're pointing to, which is how is that? No, but yeah, go on.
I was very taken by William's argument about the excess capacity. We have a Chinese state which is immobile and politically dysfunctional. We had a Japanese system which was immobile and politically dysfunctional in the 1980s. It had excess capacity which it dumped. And the American policy was orderly market economic, a range of non-tariff barriers in order to constrain a country which was strategically dependent on us. That worked. With China, this is unlikely to work. So what was the positive message of the 1980s? Is what state-level industrial policy in the South, bringing foreign investment in, making sure there were no unions, creating technological infrastructure of the training kind, because they needed a local working force. And it was a Republican states. So it was through the federal system. The Reagan administration wasn't as brutal as Trump is, but it was doing the same thing. But the federal system provided a set of things, and then the Germans woke up and said, we can do that too. So BMW and VW both did this too. And it really created the New South. The South turned politically in the early 70s, but the New South is created through Japanese and German investment at what I would call a state-level industrial policy of the kind which is what Ming is talking about in India and China at the national level. So I'm interested in when the state gets decapitated and we have a neo-patrimonial thing at the federal level, are there possibilities at other parts of the state? After all, the United States is large.
I'll say a word.
Yeah.
It's a really interesting comment. I do want to think more on it. You know, my focus has been on the decline in state capacity as a function of capital mobility and the political response to that, which is declining corporate profit tax rates, rising share of profits in multinationals, and rising use of those international profits being booked in tax havens. In addition, I focus very much on the financialization of non-financial corporations, which is a way of extracting value and generally channeling it to shareholders rather than to stakeholders, if you will. Okay, so I think the internal structure of corporate governance, the shift in corporate governance in the US has been an important factor. I'm thinking of share buybacks, I'm thinking of kind of the large corporations borrowing, not just using their profits to channel to shareholders, but actually being borrowers in order to return even more value to shareholders. So that has contributed to the profit share increase in the US, which is quite stark. I mean, in terms of the politics of that, I think you have a dual challenge, which is a kind of the right-wing reactionary response to the fact that as we were talking about yesterday, benefits going to parts of the population and feeling resentment towards that because either they're getting the same or less, and the corporate interests that I just described. So you have really a kind of dual challenge. I've been impressed with the effort to push back kind of the Green New Deal contingent in the US getting a fair amount of attention for industrial policy, for social protection that had never had a constituency of the sort since the New Deal, as you say, of the sort that would be required to make globalization in a way that might be more equitable internationally work domestically. So it's a very half response.
Yes, so Ravi, and then Min, and then we'll take the next
So a
round.
quick observation going back to the Washington Consensus and the developing country and the African focus of this. So the debates that we had on state capacity and reducing state capacity. So the argument that was made by the proponents of this was, look how badly state capacity is used. It's actually misused in this way. That's why we have to reduce it. And the argument that we were making was, well, of course, you couldn't deny that. You couldn't deny the fact that this. But on the other hand, if the state capacity goes, then you will not be able to use it for the good either. So that was the nature of the discourse. So, in a sense, we had to concede that there was a cost to this thing. But if you lost it, then it would take a lot to bring it back up again. So that was the nature of the discourse that we were having at the time.
I just make one point. As I observed the U.S.-China economic competition in the last 10 years, I think in the reindustrialization in America actually could have been feasible if the relationship had unraveled on a different path. Because 10 years ago, the Chinese firms, investors, they were very eager to invest in America, and indeed their capital is cheap, their labor cost is cheap. So China actually is the only country that can make it work, and they can fulfill American labor conditions, bring jobs, because the advantage and the U.S. profitability is just very high. And so you have the glassware, automaking, solar panel, wind power, as well as train cable cars, right? But then the national security became enormously important. So this route is almost, it's ended. And now, in the last 5 years or so, this has got to the local level too, right? So you begin to see the Chinese investments going to the localities were also, in America, were being their legislatures against the Chinese investments, and also their legislatures like against the Chinese buying property, etc. And so and then you look at who are the people who are against. Of course, it's public protest, but in a way, you kind of can find the capital capture in the U.S. So I'm puzzled. I'm a little bit confused whether to what extent this opposition to Chinese investments that may be possible for reindustrializing America is due to national security, or to what extent is due to capital capture. Because behind every single legislature, you kind of can see the interest groups against it. So I think the state capacity that Peter brings is really true, but what state capacity we are talking about? Is a state capture or its ability to execute projects. The latter, I think, is still feasible in America, but the capital capture is very strong.
And there's a very similar argument in India, where the Chinese argue that India is desperate for capital, but there's a lot of resistance to Chinese investment under a national security argument, but a lot of it is about corporate capture of industrial policy. But we have many other hands, so Prasenjit, and then Sakiko, and then Vamsi. But Prasenjit, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. I have a very simple question. Looking at, for both, I think, for William and for Ravi, and maybe also for Minya, looking at the production system in the world now, we know it's heavily dependent on value chain, right? And supply chain networks and things. And this tariff war is obviously complicating a lot of that. And America is, in fact, applying tariffs to countries. All of Southeast Asia is going to feel it because, since the first Trump era, Chinese manufacturers moved, not only their factories, but also ancillary groups came with them to Southeast Asian countries, Cambodia, Vietnam, Malaysia, and this, that, and the other. Now, strangely and interestingly, a lot of this same capital is moving back to China as part to, especially from Cambodia and so on. You see it's moving back, and China is beginning to produce the whole thing, all parts of the process. In that way, it becomes relatively self-reliant. It had a goal of self-reliant. It first thought it could do it through the same export strategy, but now, I think its goal is not necessarily to use the US markets, but other markets in the world. So I wonder what you think, and whether anybody has a database, a clear database for people like me to read on the supply chain mechanisms.
So William, do you want to take it? And then maybe Min and Ravi.
First of all, there are pretty good databases out there on intermediate goods traded, how up to date they are. And I was not even, they're a little dated, but there are really good databases. The OECD WTO puts out a trade and value added. So we're talking about how much value added is made at each step in the value chain, and that's now well tracked. It required a wholesale change in the way we collected data, because now the nation state was less important than where the value was added.
Often is it by industry or by technology, but there is one that also
aggregates, you mean? Yeah, it's possible to aggregate. I think, I'm not 100% sure what you're getting at. Moving back to China, I was not even actually aware of that. And I would like to understand more about the logic of that. And just two quick points. One is this trade diversion that you talk about. Economists talk about it as kind of moving capacity to countries that are not affected by the tariffs. And you've seen Vietnamese, Mexican imports really now, as Chinese imports come down in the US, the data do show that trade diversion. And the question is whether this kind of nationalist deglobalization phase will also address that. It's very tricky to address, given that these supply chains are now extremely deeply knit together. People are no longer even calling them supply chains. The last paper I read was complex modular ecosystems in the electronics sector. It's so much trade, importing and exporting, multiple inputs going here and then being shipped there. It's highly complex and very hard to unwind. It's kind of the logistical problem.
Min, did you want? Yeah.
In terms of supply chain studies, so some of China IP scholars, they have academic papers which relate to the data. They're confusing to me. So if you are interested, I'll look it out to share, Sanji. But I do see a report, a long commentary essay in Chinese on the trade war, the tariff, and that perhaps provides literally the best visual summaries of the changes in China's trade imbalances. And this economist, this Chinese economist, kind of course, policy is never argued openly in China, but the message was China had a problem because even for us who know China had a very high export dominance before, I was taken by how much it has gained during COVID, right? So from 2020, China was already major manufacturer exporters and export surpluses. But after COVID, basically in 2023, China accounts for about 80% of export surplus in the world, right? And the U.S. Surplus with the U.S. with Europe didn't change, but it has risen so much in virtually everywhere. And so that's where starting last year, right? So the frictions against China was across the board. So in the last year, again, according to this Chinese writing, the lawsuits against China in the WTO rose so rapidly, and most of them came from the global south. So I think China kind of that was a problem, and they needed to address. But it's almost like a past dependency, right? We thought China didn't have COVID stimulus for consumers, but it had COVID stimulus for producers, right? And so maybe the Chinese writing, the idea, the hope, the reason they are standing up in this tariff war was also they kind of hope that by this external pressure, global external pressure, that the Chinese planners could finally commit to real shift from production to consumption, because the Chinese consumers, like households, their income didn't increase. So it's not like they are not want to spending. Their income does not increase accordingly. And not to mention, and for businesses, the business profit margin, small business profit margin is very low. So you end up as a high producing economy in China and very low cost on everything, and the ability to really become a consumer is very limited. Yeah.
Can I just add one more point? I read, I think, in somebody's book on the Chinese economy, that one of the critical issues is the difference between the rate of interest on bank loans or banks give versus the loans that they charge, right? So they charge 6%, right? But when they give out loans, they charge 3%. So no, it's the other way around.
The other way around.
The other
yeah.
way around. Yeah,
Yeah.
3%, 6%. And so this may be one of the main reasons, I wonder, for lower consumption.
So bottom line is, I think the Chinese financial system has a lot of problems, and that's why real estate become such a major development. It became the depositor of assets, and then the government then used the real estate crackdown. To me, like as an observer, I kind of every round the state extract more resources from society and then reinvest it in production, right? So maybe this time there will be a new opportunity.
First, I really want to thank this panel. It's been fantastic. I mean, really, it's answered so many questions that I have had in my own head that kind of go beyond the rhetoric and the noise, you know, of the craziness. And I mean, Ravi, it's fascinating to hear you because my memory of debates about the Washington Consensus was seeing you sort of like on the other side. Now you have confessed to having been an insider critic. So, but you know, I mean, one of the points the question you ask about how can we be have been arguing against, let's continue to argue against structural adjustment and all of that today, and then be against tariffs of the present. This is actually one of the exam questions that I set in my development economics class, and some of the students are actually here, and now they know how to answer it. Anyway, I want to I have so many questions, but I'll just ask two quick ones. First of all, this is a very kind of US-China based analysis, but your point, Will, is about corporate profits. And corporate profits are not just US corporate profits, it's corporate profits everywhere. So how do you explain the position of the EU, UK, Japan, other corporate profit-driven countries? I realize that the difference might be in domestic politics, where the disgruntlement of deindustrialization has not really kind of hit the national policymakers in the same way. But why is it that the EU is so much against these tariffs that they are still arguing for free trade, basically, right? And similarly, how do you see the developing countries part of this? Because what you see is basically, you know, the hegemons kicked away the ladder. But then when little China and little India rose up, it's kicking away the ladder again.
Well,
but the hegemon is the US in this case, and not joined by the other hegemons, right? So the second question I have has to do with the vision of the new multilateralism. So last week, I organized a closed small meeting about new multilateralism in global health, focused on what does it take to keep advanced equity, particularly Global South Agency in this space. And the answer that came was actually quite interesting in going beyond the state. It was not depending on the state, because in fact, Manjari was one of the people who spoke about this, that it's the non-state actors and new forms of governance that's needed, like non-traditional forms of financing development, like the Tobin tax and things of that kind, right? And non-state actors of other kinds, civil society, but also like the local, connecting the local with the global actors who would actually push for change and who would do some of the governance, right, in a way that is more equitable, right? So so in your new multilateralism, I mean, we need to think more kind of like around new ways of actors that go beyond these hegemons, go to the small developing countries, the philanthropies, the civil society networks, and local actors. So I wondered, I mean, with just sort of the final point is that in a vision of multilateralism that would be for equity, right, and for the global South, we need a different kind of alliance making.
You know, thinking about something that Sakiko was asking towards the end of her, comment, what is the political economy of the transition, both domestically and internationally, from where we are? And I want to bring the current state of capitalism into discussion. Typically, when there are deep capitalist crises, like Great Depression or, the independence movements that occurred, Ravi was referring to Dadabhai Nauroji and so forth. You see, a redistributive, a progressive capitalism emerging after World War II, and national economic space with import substitution, industrialization, and so forth. Then 1970s, you have a deep profitability crisis. You see financialization, financial capital becoming dominant, and then globalization, right? It breaks through the previous regime. 2008 is strange because what it demanded after that crisis, what it demanded was progressive redistribution again, across different economies, and that was prevented, by those elites that actually contributed to the crisis, which continued to be powerful. They were bailed out. And what we see as a result, because the institutional overhaul that typically happens periodically in capitalism did not occur, what we actually see is something very strange. Going back to that Gramsci's quote, the new is not born, the old is dying, the new is not born. We are in the interregnum. But what the current capitalism seems to be, in large number of countries, it's neo-fascism. You can also think of it as plutocratic populism. So populism going along with some kind of plutocratic logic. But, you can also think of it as neo-fascism. How do we move from, this logic of neo-fascism? What is the political economy of the transition to multilateralism or even domestic tax policies that Ravi referred to? It's not obvious to me that we are at a place where, so is it even possible in the current world order? Are we moving towards a slightly new economic order? Are we even should we ask questions about whether capitalism can resolve some of these issues in the impending also crisis of climate change and so forth? So I'm asking a slightly bigger question.
Thank you. So maybe we'll start with you, and if you could take both Sakiko's and
Okay.
Marcy's questions, and
Okay.
we'll give every panelist a chance.
Very quickly, two great questions. On Sakiko's, I'm not an expert on the EU or Japan. They have supported the global minimum tax. Their corporations are not financialized in the same way that the Americans are. The U.S. market matters enormously to them. Like China, it is the largest market still in the world. I think the issue is this financial reform agenda that this Council of Economic Advisors has put forward, Myron, which is to get a devaluation of the dollar while retaining U.S. key currency status. And will they go along? Who's going to step up? And in some ways, this starts to respond to Vamsi's question. Is someone going to step up and replace the dollar as the key currency within a capitalist framing of international finance? And you see little kind of efforts in that direction by the EU or by the Chinese even, or by the Japanese, but nothing has really materialized in a serious way. That would change the game, I think. It would change the hegemonic structure, and it would change kind of where the exorbitant privilege is. And part of Trump's, at least stated in this working paper by this guy Moran, who wrote the working paper on the new financial architecture, to lead with high tariffs, and then come in with this financial negotiation of a devaluation is to cut U.S. defense spending overseas and get the Europeans to pony up. So, I mean, there is that piece of the kind of U.S. exceptionalism in the de-globalization agenda that affects Europe specifically. Okay? And on Vamsi's question, you know, I can't answer the big question of can capitalism solve this problem. Capitalism generates enormous amounts of value. It creates enormous amounts of global warming. And, you know, Ravi and I had a chance to talk yesterday a little bit about, and he ended with this, you know, the issue going forward is going to be how do you harness that value and how do you get it to a place where it is providing sustainable well-being and innovation at the same time. You know, can a reformulated capitalist system do that? What's the alternative? I leave that one to you, Vamsi.
So I have three quick fire thing. One is this diversion from China to Vietnam that you read. So actually last week a PhD student of mine did a dissertation exactly on this, and her estimate was that after the Trump 1 tariffs on China, of the massive increase of Vietnam's exports, about 18% was rerouting, just simply coming through, and then she divided the rest up into Chinese firms moving into produce and also Vietnamese firms. Okay. So that was roughly speaking the numbers. But it does lead to an interesting question from the optimal tariff point of view for trade theorists. Okay, so the way that we normally think of it is there's a big economy, and the other economy is the rest of the world. So you tariff the rest of the world, but if you have this business of leakage, where you tariff China, but then it raises an interesting trade theory question. What's the optimal double tariff on China and Vietnam if you have an elasticity which says that it's going to be, and you have an estimate, my PhD student has an estimate of this thing. So that's an interesting. And what rules of thumb would you develop for that? You don't need we don't have to have a 7-year research project. What's the rule of thumb? Well, might it be that you look at the deficit and might that be an appropriate rule of thumb once you've done the analysis appropriately? But we need rules of thumb, and what are the rules of thumb? So the second is the new multilateralism and so on. So it's very narrowly defined, so in very technocratic sort of thing of what should the World Bank do, which I've been thinking about in terms of its instruments. And the point is that the World Bank and the generally multilateral development banks sovereign loan instrument, where it's loaned to a country and it's repaid by that country. And that was Keynes' genius, that he designed that instrument in an appropriate way back in 1944. But that is singularly inappropriate for a multi-country where you have spillovers across country. Who benefits from what and so on and so forth. So in fact, actually, you need to move much more towards grant instruments rather than loan instrument, which is a particular implication of this new reality that we. So that's another line of work that I've been. And finally, Sakiko mentioned philanthropy, and Craig yesterday talked about the issues with our universities and so on and so forth. A few years ago, I wrote a paper with the title, "Should Egalitarians Expropriate Philanthropists?" And the answer is in equation 4.6. It says, yes, you should. How can we allow these huge fortunes to be built up by not taxing? Then when those huge fortunes are given to non-profits, we give a tax break for that. And then we give these non-profits tax breaks on the returns from those endowments. Now, if it's a small Salvation Army thing, that's one thing. But if it's a $40 billion endowment or a $10 billion endowment, questions begin to be asked about is this in fact, as Craig implied, an inequality increasing device? Philanthropy is an inequality increasing device, and I think we have to face up to that. Thank you.
Okay, so I'll be quick. On the capitalism, I think from China and India, I'm still hesitant, but from China's perspective, the states views of capitalism and populism are very continuous. That is, neither could become the dominant ideology. Capitalism is still, the Chinese state believes, is the best way to produce wealth, but then populism is the best way to ensure it's a political rule. So the Chinese way, if you look at over the years, maybe this is Confucian tradition, when they treat businesses, it's always loose for a moment and then bring them in. Same thing to the society. And relaxed society moments will be followed by a tightening of society. So if we want to find a consistent ideology of Chinese governance, it might be statism. The state always needs to be in command. Globally, I think the Chinese global game, it's kind of reactive, but also likes to take advantage of opportunities. So China now is really, same thing with Trump 1. China took this image or champion of multilateralism following Trump 1. And I think it's doing the same now. But it's not bad. When you have external pressure and China sees an opportunity to gain international influence and prestige and respect. But meanwhile, it's much more willing for China to make concessions to the negotiating partners, particularly EU, Japan, and the global South. Previously, Chinese would be much more hesitant, resistant to any possible concessions, but now it's in the more generous mood.
So thank you very much. We are at the hour. Please join me in thanking the panelists. And before you leave, we'll be reconvening here at 1:30 for a panel on contesting history and memory. But first, let's just thank the panelists.